DNA proves this famous king was not who history says. The test was never supposed to change history. The kind scientists perform quietly in controlled labs, far away from headlines and public attention. A small fragment of bone, preserved for centuries, was extracted from a royal tomb believed to belong to one of the most well-documented kings in history. His identity had already been accepted. His lineage traced. His story complete. The purpose of the test was simple: to confirm what everyone already knew. But the result did not confirm anything. Instead, it introduced a contradiction so precise, so undeniable, that it forced researchers to stop, recheck, and question something no one had questioned before. Because according to the DNA, the man inside the tomb did not belong to the royal bloodline history had assigned to him. And if that was true, then the king, this carefully recorded, widely accepted figure, might never have been who history claimed he was. At first, the anomaly was treated as an error. Scientific processes, after all, are not immune to contamination or misinterpretation. The sample could have been compromised. The extraction process could have introduced modern DNA. The sequencing could have failed in subtle ways. These possibilities were not only considered, they were expected. Because the alternative was far more difficult to accept. The alternative suggested that an entire historical identity, built over centuries, could be fundamentally incorrect. So the team repeated the process. New samples were taken from different parts of the remains. Independent laboratories were involved. The methods were refined, controlled, verified. And yet, each time the results returned, they pointed to the same conclusion. The genetic signature did not match the royal lineage that had been attributed to this king. It wasn't a minor deviation. It was a complete disconnect. This is where the mystery truly begins, because to understand why this matters, we need to understand how certain this king's identity once seemed. Historical records placed him firmly within a powerful dynasty. Inscriptions, artifacts, and burial traditions all aligned with this narrative. The tomb itself was located among other confirmed members of the same royal family. Everything about the context reinforced the belief that this individual was exactly who historians believed him to be. There were no obvious signs of intrusion, no evidence of tampering, no clear reason to doubt the identification. And yet, beneath all of that certainty, the biological evidence was telling a completely different story. One explanation is surprisingly simple, at least on the surface. It suggests that the body was misidentified. That at some point in history, perhaps during excavation, perhaps even in ancient times, the wrong individual was placed in the tomb or later assumed to be the king. This kind of mistake is not impossible. Archaeology, especially in its earlier stages, was not always precise. Records were incomplete. Methods were less rigorous. It is entirely plausible that a body could have been attributed to the wrong identity. But this explanation begins to break down under closer examination. Because the burial was not random. The artifacts surrounding the body were specific, intentional, and consistent with royal status. The inscriptions were not generic, they referenced names and titles associated with the king. If this was a mistake, it was not a simple one. It was a deeply embedded, highly convincing reconstruction of identity. Another theory goes in a different direction. Instead of questioning the tomb, it questions the lineage. What if the historical records themselves are incomplete or misleading? Royal bloodlines, especially in ancient times, were not always as straightforward as they appear. Adoptions, hidden parentage, political marriages, and unofficial heirs could all complicate genetic continuity. It is possible that the king was indeed raised and recognized as part of the royal family, but was not biologically connected in the way historians assumed. This would explain the discrepancy without requiring a misidentified tomb. But again, this theory has its limits. Because the genetic difference observed in the analysis was not subtle. It did not suggest a distant relation or a minor break in lineage. It suggested something much more extreme, an origin entirely outside the expected genetic group. This leads to a third, more unsettling possibility. one that does not fit neatly into traditional historical explanations. It suggests that the narrative surrounding this king was intentionally constructed. That identity, in this case, may have been assigned rather than inherited. Throughout history, power has often been maintained not just through blood, but through perception. If a ruler could convincingly present himself as part of a royal lineage, supported by symbols, rituals, and controlled narratives, then biological truth might not have been necessary. In such a scenario, the king's identity was real in every visible sense except the one that modern science can now measure. The breakthrough that brought this mystery into focus came from advancements in genetic sequencing technology. Unlike earlier methods, modern DNA analysis can extract and compare genetic material with remarkable precision, even from degraded ancient remains. Researchers were able to map specific markers associated with known populations and lineages, creating a detailed genetic profile of the individual. This profile was then compared to other remains believed to be part of the same royal family. The expectation was clear: they should align. But they didn't. Not even partially. The divergence was significant enough to rule out simple explanations like mutation or incomplete data. This was not a variation within a family. It was a difference between entirely separate genetic backgrounds. And this is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Because instead of resolving the mystery, the scientific evidence expands it. If the body is not the king, then where is the real king? If the king was not biologically part of the royal family, then how was his identity accepted so completely? And perhaps most importantly, how many other historical identities are built on assumptions that have never been tested? Imagine standing in a museum, looking at a reconstructed face of a king, reading about his achievements, his lineage, his place in history. Everything feels certain. Everything feels known. Now imagine learning that the very foundation of that identity, the biological reality of who he was, does not match the story being told. It changes the way you see not just that one figure, but history itself. Because history, as we understand it, is often a combination of evidence and interpretation. And when new forms of evidence emerge, they don't just add to the story, they can completely rewrite it. What makes this case particularly compelling is not just the contradiction, but the silence around it. There is no definitive answer, no single explanation that resolves every inconsistency. Theories exist, but none are complete. The evidence is clear, but its meaning remains open. And that tension, the gap between what we know and what we can explain, is what keeps this mystery alive. In the end, this is not just a story about one king. It is a story about how fragile certainty can be. About how easily identity can be constructed, accepted, and preserved without question. And about how modern science, with all its precision, does not always provide closure. Sometimes, it does the opposite. Sometimes, it reveals that the truth is not what we expected and that the past, no matter how well documented, may still be hiding something we have yet to understand. In the end, this is not just a story about one king. It is a story about how fragile certainty can be, and how easily something repeated for centuries begins to feel like truth. But the moment that certainty breaks, something else begins to emerge. Not a clear answer, but a deeper, more unsettling question: if this king was not who history says he was, then who controlled the story that made us believe he was? Because identities like this are not created by accident. They are built, reinforced, and protected across generations. And that means someone, somewhere, had a reason to make this identity appear real. When researchers began to move beyond the initial DNA results, they didn't just look at the body, they started looking at everything surrounding it with a different mindset. Every artifact, every inscription, every symbol that had once confirmed the king's identity was now treated as a potential piece of constructed evidence rather than objective truth. And what they found was subtle, but significant. Certain inscriptions, when analyzed more carefully, did not directly state identity, they implied it. Titles were used, but names were sometimes incomplete or stylized. Symbols associated with royalty were present, but not uniquely tied to a single individual. It was as if the entire tomb had been designed to guide interpretation, rather than declare a fact. This changes the nature of the mystery completely. Because now the question is not just about biological mismatch, it is about intentional design. In ancient political systems, legitimacy was everything. A ruler did not just need power, he needed to be seen as the rightful holder of that power. Bloodline was one of the strongest tools for establishing that legitimacy. But if, for any reason, the true bloodline was broken, if there was no direct heir, or if power shifted unexpectedly, then a new identity could be constructed to preserve stability. A king could be presented as part of a lineage, even if he was not born into it. And if that presentation was convincing enough, it could become accepted truth. At this point, the investigation began to expand into genetics on a broader scale. Scientists didn't just compare this king's DNA to supposed family members, they compared it to entire populations. They mapped genetic markers across regions, looking for patterns that could indicate origin. And what they discovered added another layer to the mystery. The king's DNA did not just differ from his supposed family, it aligned more closely with a completely different population, one that existed far outside the expected geographic and cultural boundaries of his kingdom. This was not a minor variation. It suggested that the individual buried in the tomb may have come from an entirely different region, possibly even a different cultural background. Now imagine the implications of that. A ruler, remembered as a central figure of a specific civilization, may not have originated from that civilization at all. And yet, he was accepted, recorded, and preserved as one of its defining leaders. This raises a possibility that feels almost counterintuitive. That identity, at least in this case, may have been more flexible than we assume. That what mattered was not where someone came from, but how effectively they could embody the role they were given or had taken. Of course, this theory does not go unchallenged. Some researchers argue that genetic overlap between populations can sometimes be misleading. Human migration, trade, and interaction have always blurred boundaries. It is possible, they suggest, that the king's genetic profile reflects ancient population mixing rather than a completely separate origin. But even this more conservative interpretation does not fully resolve the issue. Because the degree of mismatch still exceeds what would normally be expected within a royal lineage that was believed to be relatively stable and localized. Another possibility begins to emerge here, one that is less about deception and more about survival. In times of crisis, war, disease, political collapse, royal lines can disappear suddenly. When that happens, the continuity of leadership becomes more important than strict biological accuracy. A replacement may be chosen, someone capable of ruling, someone who can maintain order. And once that decision is made, the narrative adjusts. Records are written, symbols are aligned, and over time, the constructed identity becomes indistinguishable from an inherited one. If this is what happened, then the king was not an imposter in the traditional sense. He was a solution to a problem, one that history later forgot even existed. But there is still something that does not fully fit. Because even in cases of political replacement, there are usually traces, conflicts, alternative accounts, hints of transition. In this case, those traces are almost completely absent. The historical record is unusually smooth, unusually consistent. It does not show signs of disruption. And that raises another question: what if the absence of evidence is itself part of the construction? What if the narrative was not just created, but carefully maintained, with competing versions removed or never recorded in the first place? This is where the role of modern science becomes both powerful and limited. DNA can reveal biological truth, but it cannot explain intention. It can show us that something does not match, but it cannot tell us why that mismatch exists. To understand that, we have to interpret patterns, compare evidence, and accept that some answers may remain incomplete. And yet, even without a complete explanation, the impact of this discovery is undeniable. It forces us to reconsider how we define identity in historical contexts. It challenges the assumption that written records are always reliable. And it reminds us that history is not just a collection of facts, it is a narrative shaped by those who had the power to record it. Think about how many other figures in history are accepted without question. Kings, rulers, leaders whose identities are based on a combination of artifacts, texts, and assumptions. If one of them can be fundamentally misidentified, what does that say about the rest? Not that all history is wrong, but that it may be more uncertain than we are comfortable admitting. That beneath the surface of well-established narratives, there may be contradictions waiting to be discovered. There is also a more human side to this story, one that is easy to overlook. Imagine the individual at the center of it. A person who lived, ruled, made decisions, influenced lives. Regardless of his origin, he existed as a king in every practical sense. People followed him, recorded him, remembered him. His identity, whether constructed or inherited, was real to those who experienced it. And now, centuries later, we are questioning that identity based on evidence he could never have imagined. It creates a strange kind of distance between the past and the present, where modern tools reinterpret lives that were lived under completely different assumptions. I tried to think about what it would mean to discover something like this in a personal context. To believe something about your own identity for your entire life, only for new information to reveal that it is not accurate. It would not erase your experiences, but it would change how you understand them. And in a way, that is what is happening here. We are not erasing this king, we are seeing him differently. Not as a fixed historical figure, but as part of a more complex, less certain reality. And that may be the most important insight of all. Because the value of this discovery is not just in correcting a single identity. It is in expanding our understanding of how history works. It shows us that certainty is often constructed, that evidence can be reinterpreted, and that new technologies can reveal layers of truth that were previously inaccessible. It does not make history less meaningful, it makes it more dynamic, more alive, more open to exploration. So the next time we look at a name carved in stone, or read about a lineage that seems perfectly preserved, it might be worth remembering that behind every story is a process of interpretation. And sometimes, that process leaves things out. Sometimes, it simplifies. And sometimes, it creates a version of reality that feels complete, even when it is not. Because in the end, the most unsettling part of this mystery is not that one king was not who we thought he was. It is that we believed we knew him at all. If you found this story interesting, and you want to explore more mysteries like this, where science challenges everything we thought we knew, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel.